taught at BYU for 15 years. Before that, I taught at Kansas State University for 11 years. And as I mentioned in the bio, I had the opportunity there to work with, they'd have 5 or 6 Army chaplains come in each year. And then we would train them in marriage and family therapy. And they'd work at Fort Riley there, where they would see couples and clients. And that was my privilege for 11 years, is to work with those chaplains. There's actually a couple of them here today that we had the opportunity of spending time with it in Manhattan. So I have a lot of respect for what you do. I have a great deal of respect for the ministry. I think there are a few callings in the church, a few things in the church where the gospel of Jesus Christ really impacts, really kind of the rubber hits the road. One of those, of course, is nursery, where we teach kids how to be kind. One is Scoutmasters. We kind of apply the gospel to these young 12 and 13-year-olds. And then certainly the work that you do is where the gospel of Jesus Christ interacts with in a very real way with human interaction. What I want to do today is I want to arm you with a few tools via information. I think knowledge is power, especially when it's truth. And I'm a disciple of Jesus Christ, but my training, my professional training, is that of a researcher, and that is a therapist. So I want to share with you today some information that will hopefully lift you and strengthen you in your ministries of strengthening families. Now, over the weekend, I decided to add a few slides to what's in your booklet. So this first part, I added about 25 slides because I'm going to have to go a little bit quick, but I kind of wanted to set the table for the why marriage and marital quality is important. First of all, let's kind of talk about where we're at. Let me base this on the proclamation of the family. We proclaim that marriage between a man and a woman is ordained of God, and that the family is central to the Creator's plan for the eternal destiny of His children. And then near the very, very end, the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12 say, we warn that the disintegration of the family will bring upon individuals, communities, and nations the calamities foretold by ancient and modern prophets. So where are we at? Where are we at? We hear these things in the media and things. Where's the family at? Part of the proclamation is we further declare that God has commanded that the sacred powers of procreation are to be employed only between man and woman, lawfully wedded as husband and wife. Here's some statistics for you. Since 1960, the number of cohabiting people have increased by 17 times. That's not 17%, that's 17 times. 25% of those between the age of 25 and 39 in the United States, this is U.S. data, are currently cohabiting. A quarter of them are currently cohabiting. Overall, going from 18 up to age 99, 11% of all women and 12% of all men are currently in cohabiting relationships. And 40% of those cohabiting relationships include children. Now, kind of what we oftentimes think about in terms of cohabiting are, people that are going to college, they're going to Harvard or Stanford, and they meet in their intro to psychology class, and they date, and then they start living together. But the truth of the matter is the cohabitation covers all spectrums of our society, all ages. Cohabitation among the elderly is increasing because when they're 89 years old, they just don't feel like another wedding, and so they just start living together. Here's a graph that illustrates the increase in cohabitation over the last about 50 years. Notice there was about 400,000 in 1960. It's up to 7.5 million with the latest data that we have. Now, factors, again, we think about, well, they cohabit at Stanford, they cohabit at Harvard, but the truth of the matter is the most cohabitation occurs in trailer parks. Less educated, lower income, less religious, previously divorced, parents got divorced, they grew up without a father, and there's a high level of marital conflict during childhood. A common scenario with cohabitation are two people who are divorced. They each have a couple of kids. They got burned once in marriage. They don't want to do it again, and they meet someone, and they so they start living together because marriage is soured on them. It used to be that the divorce rate was high. We'll talk about divorce in a little bit. Divorce rate was high, but remarriage rates were incredibly high. And so most people just remarried within the next couple of years. But what we're finding in the data is that remarriage is much, much less popular than it used to be. That cohabitation is a very, very common response to becoming divorced and then having a new relationship. This, I think, is probably the most important slide I'm going to share with you today. I think this is such an important slide. Now, these are the, again, the metric is per 1,000, how do you, but the comparisons are compelling. Notice here are our kids living with both biological parents who are still married. Look, the risk for physical abuse, sexual abuse, and emotional abuse are minuscule. Here's the step families where your mom gets divorced and remarries, and you're living with your mom and a stepdad, or the other way around. Quite a bit higher. This one right here is where both of your parents are cohabiting, your parents have never gotten married. Notice the difference between these and this right here. I mean, the probabilities are just 3, 4, 5 times greater of being molested, being physically abused, or emotionally abused. Now look at this right here. This is a parent with a cohabiting partner. And I see this all the time in counseling where the mom has a boyfriend and the boyfriend moves in. The rates now skyrocket. The risk factors skyrocket. In terms of physical abuse, sexual abuse, and emotional abuse. Notice by far the highest risk factor for kids are living with a parent with a boyfriend or a girlfriend in the home. I think that is compelling data. And one of the themes I want to share with you today is as our society has changed, as it's more from its moral foundations, adults are doing what's convenient. The casualty of that, besides their own spiritual development, some other things we'll talk about, are the children. One of the biggest, and this is the literature talks about this, the research talks about this, one of the biggest shifts in American society, and that includes Western Europe as well, is that children are no longer valued the way they used to be. It's the wishes of the adults, what feels good, what's good for them in their own mind. And the kids are being trampled on. That's one of the themes. We're not nearly as child-focused as we used to be. And this is good data. Again, minuscule risk factor for kids when the mom and dad are married to each other and there's some biological kids. And it just rises in all the other configurations. So what you oftentimes hear is, well, cohabitation makes sense because, of course, we wouldn't test drive a car we wouldn't buy a car before we test drove it, right? Well, duh, we should test drive a marriage before we make the commitment. And so the folklore out there is that cohabitation makes sense because you can test drive your marriage, your relationship, make sure it works, and then get married if it's a good situation. However, the research is very clear that cohabitation is related to, so couples live together and then they subsequently get married. Their divorce rates are much higher risk than couples who don't cohabit. We're talking about any religious configuration, whatever you want, and also their marital quality is lower. The research on that's compelling. And again, but what you hear out there is, well, gosh, you should test drive your relationship first. The research doesn't support that at all. For example, well, again, we're talking about kids. This is the percentage of children who experience a parental separation by age 12 based on their mother's marital status. So when this 12-year-old was born, if mom was married to the dad, there's a 24% chance that relationship, that marriage will dissolve by the time this kid's 12. Almost 2.5 times greater if the couple is cohabiting when this kid gets married, when this kid's born. Again, a huge casualty in all of these social changes that are occurring in our society are the children. This is an interesting graph that talks about the percentage of high school seniors who agree or mostly agree with the statement, it is usually a good idea for a couple to live together before getting married in order to find out whether they really get along by period United States. So I gotta put on my glasses here. 69% of boys and 63% of girls, high school seniors, believe that cohabitation is a good idea because it'll lead to a better marriage. And what do the data say? Just the opposite. There's a lot of misinformation out there. Okay, another part of the proclamation, marriage between man and a woman is essential to his eternal plan. One of the things we're finding is that people are waiting later to get married. I know there's concern about that. I hear that concern expressed by some of our church leaders. Here's the graph. Right now, the current average age at first marriage for males is 29 in the United States and 27 for females. Much, much higher than it used to be. And they talk about this great crossover effect. What this says is that the average age of getting married now is higher than the average age of having a child. That's a problem. It used to be, you fall in love, you get married, then you have a kid. In fact, I think the little first graders talk about that. It's not that way anymore. By age 25, 44% of women have a baby, but only 38% of them are married. So there's this great crossover effect where the average age of marriage now has outstripped the average age of having a baby. Now, what are the costs of delayed marriage? One thing is it's much, much more likely that they have premarital sex. I found these data interesting. This is national data. This isn't U.S. data. But 75% of people, by the time they turn 20, have had premarital sex. It's 95% by age 44. So what we've learned, what the data say, and what we know from our own experiences, after age 20, the more years they remain single, the more at risk they are to have premarital sex. They're much more likely, as we talked about, to have a baby out of wedlock. Now, this is the interesting part, because part of our culture is that sitcom Friends, where these single 20-somethings are just having the time of their lives, a little bit of drama, but just having this great time. But the research shows that unmarried people in their 20s, many of whom are cohabiting, are more likely to be depressed, to drink excessively, and to be unhappy in their life. So the media, our culture is deceiving what we call in the church young adults. The literature calls emerging adults. That 20-somethings where they're just having the time of their life, the research doesn't hold. And part of that I mentioned is out of wedlock children. I think this graph right here is shocking. In 2011, 72% of babies born to African American mothers were born out of wedlock. 72%. The national average is right here, right there, 41%. So right now, 41%, I've heard of this up to 43% now, 41% of all babies being born in the United States are born to a mom and dad who aren't married to each other. And then the risk factors are very clear to children. They're much, much less likely to have good education. They're much, much less likely to grow up in an intact family. The strikes against a kid born out of wedlock is just tragic. And yet 41% nationally are born out of wedlock. I just heard a statistic last week. I haven't found the source yet, so I didn't put it in here. But I've heard that under age of 30, mothers under the age of 30, it's over half now. Over half of babies that are born to women of all races under the age of 30 are born out of wedlock. Huge problems. Again, the besides the spiritual and all these other issues that occur to the adults, a huge part of the tragedy is the children. Okay, now part of this also is that marriage has become less popular. And what we heard for years as a social scientist, it was what I heard was, we divorce a lot, cohabitation's common, but we still love to get married in the United States. We've changed, but that's not the case anymore. marriage is falling out of favor. And it's this graph right here that's the most telling. The bottom graph. Again, per 100, per 1,000, that's hard to interpret. The trend is what's helpful here. Marriage right now is the least popular it's ever been in the United States, and it's the same way in Western Europe. Cohabitation is certainly a part of that, is it's replaced it. Although one of the things I hope you get from these data in my presentation is that cohabitation is not a substitute for marriage. Any metric, cohabitation does not compare to marriage. The percentage of people between the ages of 35 and 44 who are currently married, now it's down to 65%. I think this is a sad statistic here. This is high school seniors who agreed or mostly agreed that most people will have fuller and happier lives if they choose legal marriage rather than staying single or just living with someone. Only 39% of males believe that, and only 29% of females believe that. Less than a third of high school seniors across the country of females believe that getting married is a good way to go. Again, the media and our culture is giving a lot of false doctrine out there. Let me say something about same-sex couples. Right now, you probably heard this is front page news right now because the Supreme Court just announced that it was not going to wasn't going to hear Utah's case as well as another state's case. And so the talk right now is that we're going to start doing marriages again in Utah is what the talk is. I wanted to give you just a little bit of data. There are about 600,000 same-sex couples in the United States. About a quarter of them are legally married. That's probably going to increase quite a bit now that the Supreme Court has failed to deal with the issue. And what's interesting is I was kind of working on this a couple of months ago, putting these slides together. So there's 600,000 same-sex couples out there in varying degrees of legal marriage, legal in quotes marriage. There's 56 million married couples. And I just thought that, why does 600,000 have such a loud voice over 56 million? I mean, good grief. Our church leaders have spoken a lot about this. I just thought I'd share with you kind of from the academic perspective, the professor perspective, where the battleground right now is in terms of what the effect is on children. It's hard to compare same-sex couples with married couples in terms of are they less depressed, are they this or that, because what their argument is, we have to be careful because their argument is that's because you don't let us get married. If you just let us get married, we'd be as good off as the heterosexual couples. So that's a kind of a tricky argument we don't want to get trapped into. So one of the ways that researchers have gone at this from both the pro same-sex marriage and the opposing is, well, what's the effect of kids being raised in a same-sex family as opposed to a mom and a dad family? And this is a very, very controversial issue. Let me just share a little bit about this. So a few years ago, the American Psychological Association, huge, tens and tens and tens of thousands of members, they did a huge blue ribbon panel commission to look at all the research on this, and they concluded that there's not one study out there that has found that kids that grow up in a same-sex family are at a disadvantage in terms of, self-esteem, school performance, et cetera, et cetera. And based on that, APA, the American Psychological Association, passed a resolution saying that they're in favor of same-sex marriage because the research has found that there's no negative effects. And based on that, other associations have done the same thing. One of the ones that we're involved in is the National Council of Family Relations, which has historically been fairly conservative. They came out last year with a statement saying there's no research out there, therefore we support it. Well, there's an LDS professor at Louisiana State named Malorne Marks. He thought, I want to take a better look at this. So he went through all the studies that APA looked at and found huge, huge methodological problems. For example, a number of the studies compared same-sex couples with a single parent who said they were heterosexual. Well, that's not a fair comparison. And I could go on and on and on and on like that. Some of the sample sizes were so small that statistically you wouldn't find a difference. And he went through and critiqued all of these studies and said, by the way, what about this study over here that you guys didn't mention? This one shows that there's a negative effect of growing up in a same-sex family. And he got it published. The editor says, we hate this stuff, we don't like it, but it was so well written, it was so compelling, we got to publish it. And he's been creamed professionally. He's been creamed. I mean, just some of the stories that I've heard him tell is people ransacking his home. I mean, I could just go on. It's just the persecution he has taken for that is amazing. There was a professor at the University of Texas about the same time who published a study that showed that children of same-sex couples did poorer than children in heterosexual parent couples, families. And he's been basically blackballed from the profession. I mean, the anger, the angst is just incredible. That's where the battleground is. And people want to hear, they don't want to hear data. They just, and what's interesting is, and then there'll be these other studies that are just really poorly done, and they get published in the top journals because it says what people want it to say. It's just terrible. Okay, quick thing about divorce. The divorce rate's high, as you can tell by the trends. It peaked in 1981. So so for you to say the ever-increasing divorce rate isn't entirely accurate. It peaked in 1981, and it sort of drifted a little bit downward since then. Still sky high, but it peaked in 81. The probability today, and again, I try to go with the data. What does the data say? What does the good research tell us? Because there's so much junk out there. The best data I could find is 45%. A couple being married today have a 45% chance of getting divorced. However, there's important risk factors we need to keep in mind. Low income. If someone's from low income, if someone's from a high income, their chances of getting divorced decreases by 30%. Having a baby, or whichever way this study's going, you can follow my drift. Having a baby 7 months or more after a marriage, in other words, it's not a premarital pregnancy, increases your odds by 24% of not getting divorced. Marrying over to the age of 25 gives you 24%, as opposed to 18. Family of origin intact, 14%. Religious affiliation, 14%. Being a college graduate as opposed to a high school dropout wins you 25% better odds. So do you see what we're talking about here? So that's why most temple marriages do well, do better. It's still too high. We don't know how high it is because that data is privileged. But someone who's married in the temple is probably not going to have a premarital pregnancy going on. They're not going to be drinking alcohol. They have a religious affiliation. I mean, they're doing things besides the spiritual and the covenant benefits of marriage. They're doing a lot of things that doesn't put them at a higher risk for divorce. As opposed to someone who's 18 years old, got pregnant, their parents hate the kid's guts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That puts them at a 90%. So when you hear that word 45%, that's not what you teach the beehives, because that's not true. From an LDS perspective, the way our theology is set up and the church is set up, our risk is going to be much more minimal than this group over here. So I think that's really important to mention, because you always hear that half of divorce is going to end in divorce. Well, it's about 45%, but again, you got to play with those risk factors. Costs of divorce to children, is significant. There's a couple of data I want you to share with you. Poverty is a common consequence, partly because 3/4 of custodial parents, typically the woman does not get child support like they're supposed to. Here's the part I think is interesting. National research has found that the cost of each year nationally for babies born to unmarried women and divorce is $112 billion. That's just the welfare costs in terms of the child. It doesn't include all the cost to the grown-ups. Huge cost to society. $112 billion. Okay, now a lot of the stuff I shared with you, if you go to, the booklets are called The State of Our Unions. And they're put out pretty much every year, and it's by the National Marriage Project. It's housed in Virginia, University of Virginia. You can just go online and download their PDFs. They don't do the research themselves, they compile it all, and it's good stuff. Also, there's a booklet out called Why Marriage Matters, again, done by some of the top researchers in the field. There's the website for that. I Googled it last night, and so I Googled Why Marriage Matters, and the one that came up was this gay and lesbian site saying why they should get married. So go one more down on Google, okay? Let me say the politics of this thing right now are really tough. For example, the one study I mentioned from the University of Texas that showed that same-sex parents had kids that do poorer than the heterosexual parents. One of our BYU faculty was a big part of that study and helped write it up and stuff. And as they got ready to send it out for publication, the decision was made by some really good, wise people that his name shouldn't be on there, because if BYU's name was on there, it would blow up. And it blew up anyway. But anyway, so BYU's actually we've been doing quite a bit of stuff with this, but we kind of do it behind the scenes because our name is so toxic. Our name, is yeah, and I'm just not talking about Easter. I'm just talking about the bench on Salt Lake. It really is. So we've done quite a bit of things to try to help the cause and trying to produce information to support the traditional family. But we've had to be careful because of the politics. And it's crazy that we just can't let science rule the day on some things. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about what you have. Now, why does this all matter so much? I've talked about marriage is becoming less popular, divorce rates are high, et cetera, et cetera. Well, because it has some very real impact on people and on society. Let me share some of those with you. Again, you have them, so I'll just give you some highlights. Marriage has found that getting divorced was as dangerous on a man's health as smoking a pack of cigarettes a day. Go down a ways. Being non-married is a greater mortality risk factor for men than having heart disease. See, we're tying marriage to these money variables, we might call. Smoking, we know, is important. Cardiovascular disease. Being non-married is a greater mortality risk factor for women than having cancer. Married people obviously are healthier. And one reason why is that they tend to live healthier lifestyles. And this is especially true for men, but it also holds for women. Married people drink less. For example, single men drink twice as much as married men do. Wives encourage their husbands to eat more nutritious food and to have good sleep habits. Wives encourage husbands to visit the doctor and comply with doctor's directives. I just got to tell you real quick. About 5 or 6 years ago, I started having some chest pains. And they just kind of kept bothering me and just, ugh. And what did I do? Nothing, because I'm a guy. So I just kind of went on, and one day my wife says, you just kind of keep holding your chest. What's going on? I said, man, I've been having chest pains. How long? I don't know, for about 2 weeks. She called the hospital. She says, so I went to the emergency room. One thing I learned about the emergency room, when you take your kids to the emergency room for a broken arm, it takes about a day and a half to be seen, right? People have to bring food in, When you go into chest pains, man, it's reinforcing. They just pay attention to you. And man, they ripped my shirt off. And it turned out it was heartburn and acid reflux and all that kind of junk. But still, my wife, that's why I'm living longer, huh? Men live better when they're married. And it's the same thing with women, but not nearly as much. They don't need as much babysitting as we do. Married people have better mental health. Widowed and divorced adults are 3 times more likely than married adults to commit suicide, depression, anxiety. This is interesting. I gave this presentation in Taiwan this summer for the church. parts of this presentation, because they're having a real problem in Taiwan with people getting married because they think like that they need to be financially secure, and so the marriage age is rising way up, including in the church. And one of the reasons why is I can't afford it. What the research shows is that married people do better off financially. And I know that none of you are believing that right now, but it's true. Married men make more money than single men even when they have the same job. We're motivated. We want to do well. We want our annual evaluations to go well because that's going to give us a little bit of bigger pay raise. And 0.2% over the years adds up. Married people accumulate more financial assets. I know some of you are going, you're seeing this slide and you're seeing the word student loans. I know that. But on a longer term basis, married people do better financially than single people do. Children do better when there's two parents in the home, two parents. And remember that graph I showed you earlier on. Now, what I've talked about is the idea of being married. And there's two aspects of marriage. One is your marital status. The other one is your marital quality, the marital process. How do you guys dance together? It's interesting. I've been talking about how the healthiest people out there that do the best in so many ways are married, never married, widowed, and divorced. And then people about 20 years ago started saying, well, what about the quality of the marriage? Because not everyone is happily married. So they kind of divided up the married people between those that were happily married and those who were unhappily married. And here's the rank order. Happily married, never married, widowed, divorced, and unhappily married. The least healthy people in our society are those that are in bad marriages. And what I'm reading right now in the literature suggests between 20 and 30% of our society at any given time, of marriages at any given time, would be classified as unhealthy. 20 to 30%. And again, if that were another thing, we would call that an epidemic, wouldn't we? 20 to 30% of whatever disease you can think of would be considered an epidemic. But we don't give marriage the due that it deserves. And the reason why that is social support. I mean, when you're in a good marriage, you're cheering each other on, you're encouraging each other, you're rooting for each other. And when you're in a bad marriage, you don't get that at all. In fact, instead, you get criticism and hostility and stuff. Let's see. I want to give you this one. This is telling. The evidence regarding marital relationships and health increasingly approximates the evidence that established cigarette smoking as a cause or risk factor for mortality and morbidity for a range of diseases. Morbidity is sickness. The age-adjusted relative risk factors are stronger than the relative risk factors reported for all cigarette smoking. Now, that's a lot of legalese, scholarly talk saying that what the research is showing is that being in a bad marriage is worse for your health than smoking. And again, how much energy is our society and how much money is our society putting into smoking and anti-smoking stuff? I mean, I turn on the radio, it's an anti-smoking, which is wonderful. Smoking's a bad idea. But what the research is showing is that being in a bad marriage is worse for your health than smoking is. For example, marital conflict is a major risk factor for a lot of diseases, cardiovascular disease, ulcers, chronic pain, atherosclerosis, because it's stress. We know that stress is a huge risk factor for health problems. And what's one of the biggest stressors you can have in your life is being in a really lousy marriage, where there's a lack of support, there's a lot of criticism, hostility, anger, and that stress is there day after day after day, and it eats at you, and it causes health problems. We've done some research, a lot of my research is in this area right here. We've done a lot of research showing that being in an unhappy marriage not only causes health problems, well, not surprisingly, it also leads to higher health care utilization. People in bad marriages are more likely to go to the doctor more often, more likely to take more medication, and more likely to have hospital visits. And again, our society cares about health care, right? Well, here we have it right here. Major conflict is a major risk factor. Marital conflict is a major risk factor for psychological problems. One longitudinal study found that people in distressed marriages were 2.5 times more likely than those in happy marriages to be depressed 1 year later. One of the major risk factors for depression is being in a bad marriage. Now, one of the things I've done in the last few years is I've been doing research over in Asia and Taiwan and China. I went to Hong Kong on my mission. Asian studies is part of my background. So I've been doing research with colleagues in Beijing and Taipei and those places. And so I've been testing this idea in Asia because I thought, well, we know that bad marriages have all these problems in America, but we're kind of fixated on relationships, the soulmate and all this kind of stuff. What about more collectivistic societies where the family is kind of defined as a larger system and the marital system is just one piece of it with the grandparents, 3-generational households, all that kind of stuff. So what is that like in a more of a collectivistic society? So I've tested that in China and Taiwan, and I also have some data from Brazil. And it's the same. No matter what kind of culture they're from, a bad marriage leads to bad things. Major risk factor for child maladjustment. Again, most of the research has been about whether or not kids are better off in a single-parent family, a two-parent family, that kind of stuff. What we're finding is that the research is there's a lot of research about this, that kids that grow up in a war zone don't do well. Kids that grow up in a war zone don't do well, and that war zone is within their own home. And there's two reasons for that. The research is suggesting, and this is every country in the world has pretty much shown this. When your mom and dad are screaming and yelling at each other, it's hard to do your homework, isn't it? Hard to sleep at night. I've heard kids tell me that in counseling. I can't sleep at night because my mom and dad are yelling at each other. Well, that's hard on them. The other thing is, we know that when parents fight a lot, they're not as effective in their parenting. That the amount of warmth in their parenting goes down and the amount of hostility in their parenting goes up, which then leads to poor child outcomes. And you've had that experience before. I mean, hopefully you haven't, but think about those. They might have had that experience. You're kind of in a tiff with your spouse, and your little 6-year-old comes in and asks for a popsicle for the 11th time. By that time, you're all like, honey, we've talked about this before. No, you're more likely to snap, aren't you? Which isn't good parenting. So those are kind of the two pathways. Stress and bad parenting is kind of the reason why marital conflict has such a negative effect on kids. We sometimes talk about overt conflict versus covert marital conflict. Overt is where you're fight. And covert conflict is the silent treatment. No, I'm not mad. Why do you? The silent treatment, passive-aggressive stuff. And the kids struggle under both scenarios. Okay, now we've done some research recently, and we're continuing this, showing that marital conflict is associated with less productivity in the workplace. I'm just doing some research on this right now with my doctoral student, and using a huge national data set, we've found that couples that fight more, that have lower marital satisfaction, miss work more often. That's called absenteeism, but it also predicts presenteeism. Presenteeism is when you go to work, but you're not productive. And what the research is showing, and again, we just replicated this in Beijing and found out the same thing holds in Beijing, that when you're in a bad marriage, when you're in a conflicted marriage, you just don't do as well at work. So the benefits of a strong marriage, to wrap this up, then we'll have some questions and answers. Longer lives, better mental health, less healthcare utilization, fewer risky behaviors, less depression, better financial well-being, better adjustment of children, better parenting behaviors, more work productivity. That's stuff we want. How about society? Again, society. We're talking the societal level. Remember the proclamation of the family. We warn. Strong marriages, being married and being married in a good marriage leads to lower health care costs, lower poverty rates, greater economic prosperity, less alcohol abuse, lower suicide rates, higher school achievement among children, lower delinquency rates among children, and greater work productivity. What society wouldn't want those things? What society wouldn't want to have those benefits? Well, those benefits come from having two people, male and female, who are married to each other, who are in a happy, healthy, productive relationship. What can we do? We could spend an hour on this. Let me mention a couple things that might apply directly to your ministry. The research on premarital education shows that it's effective. The Catholics are good at this. Most Priests won't marry someone unless they've had the premarital stuff a little bit. It's effective. The research is also very clear that marital education is effective, that those 6-week workshops on parenting, the 6-week workshops on how to have a happier marriage, those work. The research is very clear, hundreds of studies. And of course, we know that marital therapy is effective, as long as it's done by someone who knows what they're doing. Marital therapy is pretty tricky work. It's what I specialize in. And it's a little bit like brain surgery. If you go in there and think you're a referee, you're just going to mess people up. If you're focused on whose fault it is, you're just going to mess people up. But if you're going to look at the dance, because except for infidelity and abuse, most marital relationships are characterized by two decent people that just can't dance together very well. And instead of figuring out whose fault it is, and that's what people come when they come to marital therapy, right? Their agenda is fix my spouse. I've been praying and praying. Brother Miller, I've been praying that we would meet you because I've been trying to figure out how do I fix my spouse? And that's what the other partner says too. And the whole trick of doing marital therapy, by the way, is having them switch their thinking from fix my spouse to help us to learn to dance better, because it's a dance. And that takes some skills. That takes someone who has some experience. And so, but it works. We have some tools. And I would suggest that these are God-given tools. Marital education, we do it in Sunday school. LDS Family Service has a great program for marital education. We have tools out there, and hopefully we can use them because the research says that helps. Okay, so let's entertain some questions for the next 9 minutes or so. I hear there's some microphone people, and I'm willing to answer any questions.
When you ask your question, can you wait to get a microphone?
Thank you.
Chaplain Larson, you said that the research is pretty clear that people are better off, people are worse off if they're in highly conflictual marriages. A common complaint that I hear, and one that Elder Dallin H. Oaks highlighted in a talk on divorce, which I'm sure you're familiar with, he said that people complain that they're better off, the children are better off not having us fighting so much, so they're better off having us not be together at all. And he then said that over 3 out of 5 couples that were in that highly conflictual category were happily married 5 years later. So I'm hearing the tension here that those are the worst outcomes are in the highly conflictual marriages for children, for the couples themselves, their health. And that's versus what appears to be kind of sticking it out and hoping to be one of the 60% plus that will get better 5 years down the road. And I was wondering how you would mediate between those two groups, that set of data. Is that clear? Question?
Yeah, I mean, obviously I support Elder Oaks. That's on the record, right? But let me say though that my comments are not a pro-divorce comment. My comments are an anti-conflict. I believe that I've spent 28 years of my life helping couples, and some of these couples have come in on their deathbeds, and if they both have a good heart and are willing to work, I've seen miracles, absolute miracles. And so I agree with Elder Oaks, because later on he says the remedy of these issues aren't divorce, it's repentance. And that's exactly what I believe. In fact, that's what September 2011, I think is what I wrote in the Ensign about that, for repentance and forgiveness. So the one study that I've heard that study before, and I've heard other people, so I'm not into waiting it out because, gosh, there's a 6% chance we're going to get better. I think we ought to use our resources. We ought to use our bishops. We ought to use our resources in helping them. Sometimes a sick kid, maybe the ear infection will get better, but I just assume, well, I don't want to get into antibiotics. You know what our metaphor says, right? Sometimes treatment is a good idea, but fix it.
Thank you, sir. I wish my wife was here to hear this.
Yeah, that's what they all say.
But in this dance, what happens how do you intervene when A causes B, which B causes A. My wife steps on my toe, which causes me to yell, which causes her to kick me in the shin, which causes me to, it's just this, she causes me to do this. I'm not talking for me and my friend, but she causes me to do this, I cause her to do that, and then it's just this never-ending cycle of cause.
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. In the family therapy research, we call that the vicious cycle. The more my wife does this, the more I do that, and then it just trigger each other, right? The most common way that looks in a relationship is the demand-withdraw relationship. The more my wife demands from me, the more I'm going to burrow into my hole, and the more I burrow into my hole, the more my wife chases me, right? And the nice thing about the vicious cycle, what I love about the idea of the vicious cycle, is that either partner can change it. If I quit withdrawing, my wife is going to quit chasing me. If my wife quits chasing me, I'm going to quit withdrawing. Does that make sense? One of the characteristics of a vicious cycle is it feeds on itself. Either partner can stop it.
Two questions. One, do you recommend any standard questionnaires and surveys? I know there's lots out there to help a couple assess or kind of narrow down some of the problems. And then two, in counseling a family and you think they're in that 40% category that's just not going to make it, what are those recurring waves or stages or signs and symptoms that it might be best just to do divorce?
In terms of instruments, there's a lot of marital instruments out there that are good. BYU right now, we're involved in a study. We're collaborating with Auburn, University of Connecticut, Utah State, and another university. We're using the same instruments at these different sites so that we can, get more diverse data and also build up our sample sizes quicker. And we're using what's called the couple satisfaction inventory. The dyadic adjustment scale is fine, whatever. And it does help. I think that some of that, if this is part of your ministry, I think using assessments helps because it's objective data. That if they fill out this questionnaire, you say, well, you know what, this says you're divorced. This says you're depressed. Well, that's a lot more, that's better than saying, I think you're depressed, and the person says, I knew you'd take my spouse aside. And so I think there's something to be said if it's available in your situation that the objective, something on depression, the Beck Depression Inventory, although that costs, something on anxiety, something on marital quality, marital satisfaction. I think those are all very, very helpful. And I especially like those for premarital stuff because the premarital stuff, they all come in and their whole goal isn't to blame each other. The whole goal is to convince you they're perfect. And so the questionnaire, by the way, in fact, here's one for you. It's called RELATE, RELATE, RELATE. .org, I think it is, or relateinstitute.org. It comes out of BYU. It's been used for 30 years now, and it's an assessment instrument that the man and woman, either married or not married, can take. And then, it asks them about finances, asks about this and that, and those kind of things. And then it gives them a report, instantaneous report back saying, here's your strengths as a couple, and here are your areas of growth. They don't use the word weakness because that's too pejorative, right? Areas of growth there, And it's great feedback. It's RELATE. And I highly recommend that. Yes, sir.
So I'm a.
I'm going to ask you a question in a second. Go ahead.
Okay.
Okay, go ahead.
I'm sorry about that.
It's on hold over there.
I'm an MFT student right now. And,
You're a what student?
MFT.
Okay.
So part of my degree path is MFT. My question is what model of marriage therapy do you subscribe to in terms of therapeutic model, and how would a chaplain potentially incorporate a therapeutic model in their ministry?
I think that it's a great tool. I use a lot of cognitive behavioral stuff because it kind of fits both individually, depression, anxiety, and also couples work. And I think having, the more better trained you are, the better off you are. And so having a good model to work with that we have some confidence in helps. Okay, your other question was, what about the 40%? I think that you intervene. I tell couples this all the time. They say, we came in here, we think we're going to have to get a divorce. And I said, how do you know? Let's go for it. Alma 32, let's plant a seed. Let's get this thing, let's see if we can grow one, And in fact, I'm telling, let's try it for 3 months. Let's just try it for 3 months and see if I can't resuscitate you guys. And at least give this thing a shot. And a lot of people come in thinking that their illness is terminal. And if you're a good therapist, and with two people that try hard, it's amazing the miracles that occur. And part of that's the atonement. I'm such a believer in the atonement. The longer I do therapy, the more I believe in the atonement. The more I believe in the atonement. And you have access to that in your ministry. comment here. While he's coming down, let me give you a 25-second talk about how to save a marriage, okay? So when a couple comes in and they're in crisis, it's almost like they're coming into ER. And the first thing you have to do when they come into ER is you have to stop the bleeding, right? And so the first thing I try to do is like this couple comes in and they're just on a nosedive. And they're just ready to crash. The first thing I have to do is I have to, first of all, get the airplane flying straight. And then I'll work on the audio-visual system, and I'll try to get the air conditioning to work better, right? But when this thing's going like this, the first thing I have to stop is get the plane going right. And the way to do that in relationship stuff is to change the ratio of positive and negative behaviors. When they're in a nosedive, it's 99% negative and 1% positive. And so the first aid, if you will, the way to stop the bleeding is get them to change the ratio. I know you guys don't like each other right now, but I want you to quit being negative and be positive in ways that are realistic. Thank you for dinner. Thank you for doing the dishes. Thank you for working so hard. And that thing's going to start flying a little bit straighter. And once we get it flying straighter, then we have a chance. But I'm not going to talk about family of origin. Let's do a genogram. No, I'm not going to do it. I want to keep them from crashing first. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to have them completely shift their positive and negative ratio. Positive, positive, positive. And then after that, then I'm going to try to get them to each look inward, because most of them are thinking it's all his problem, it's all her problem. In fact, Elder Uchtdorf gave the best talk in priesthood meeting about looking inward, didn't he? Is it I? And that's the concept. It's not all my fault, but what am I doing that's contributing to this problem? And as I start looking inward, and we actually call that repentance, then things are going to start even getting better. And then as we forgive each other, then that poison that's in our heart starts going away, and we can be one again. So the overall basic formula, now how to pull that off is the art of therapy, right? Or the art of, that's where the inspiration comes. That's where your ministry, that's where the inspiration comes. But where you're going, and the Holy Ghost, right. That'll help you. That'll help you. Get them flying straight, repentance, and forgiveness. One last comment, and then I'm going to keep talking until they tell me to sit down. So, yes.
So, Dr. Miller, one of the things you mentioned was all except for the cases of domestic violence and
Infidelity.
So, what in those? And I know this is probably could open up another hour conversation, but anything brief that you could give us to help with cases like that?
Yeah, I always mention that because I'm talking about how two parties are a part of this, and in cases of infidelity and abuse, it's not two parties. It's a victim and a perpetrator, right? So I want to be very clear about that. That's a different situation, and that it's about repentance. My experience is, there's no data out there on this, but my experience of doing this for decades has been the couples where the perpetrator repents their guts out, just lays it on the line with the bishop, lays it on the line with the therapist, no more secrets, totally transparent, totally humble, forsakes everything. They're the ones that heal. And the ones that minimize and just sort of tell a story when they get caught, it never heals. And so that's why I tell clients, I say, you're feeling totally out of control right now because your spouse is trying to figure out whether she's going to leave you or not. What you have control over is how you respond to this. And if you repent like crazy, there's a good chance this thing will heal. And that's been my experience time after time after time.
Dr. Miller, one
Last one?
last
last
question.
One. Okay.
You had mentioned in one of the statistics about children that are raised with both parents versus children that were raised in a
Different configurations.
different configuration. Well stated. That what is the, and obviously the data is controversial, but what is the ratio there between homosexual couples and heterosexual couples in comparison to being raised by two females or two males versus a mother and father?
In terms of abuse and that kind of stuff, I haven't seen any data at all. And if there is, it's probably been suppressed and it's locked up in some mountain in Montana. I haven't seen any data on that. But how well the kids do, that's that huge controversy where it's so politically charged right now. Let me just conclude by bearing my testimony. As I mentioned a couple minutes ago, one of the greatest things I've learned in my work with couples and doing research and this kind of stuff is just the incredible power of the atonement and its ability and its power to help people heal. I have such a strong testimony of that. I have such a strong testimony of the Savior and how he makes it possible for people to heal and to grow into strength and become more Christ-like. And may we, in all of the work that we do, and no matter what our situations in life, may we be strong proponents and strong testifiers of the atonement in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.